Hello YouTube, Dave here again. So I thought I would pick up my series once again where I was just kind of reminiscing about my experiences with some of the previous editions of Dungeons & Dragons. I've already done a couple of videos talking about 2nd edition AD&D as well as 3rd edition D&D and even sort of my experience running an Eberron campaign and what I was hoping to do with that. There's a couple campaigns that I ran for 3.5 that I'm going to save for their own separate videos because I actually want to review the individual adventures that made up each of those campaigns on their own. So that's something that I already started with Shackled City, and I'm hoping to get back to that in the next week or so. But anyway, today I wanted to talk about my experiences with 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I make it no secret that when I finally, gave it the opportunity, I really enjoyed a lot about 4th edition D&D. There are some complaints that, a lot of people have had that, some are valid and some are issues that were actually more rooted in the 3rd edition that people seem to skim over when it came to that. But I'm not really here to necessarily talk about that today. I want to talk about my genuine reactions to 4th edition and what changed, because like a lot of people, when 4th edition was first announced, I was pretty upset by the announcement. And the biggest reason for that is I was collecting D&D 3.5 at the time, and I had virtually everything that had come out for it. I think the only books, by the time they made the announcement, that I hadn't picked up were the Unearthed Arcana, because it was a whole bunch of optional rules that I wanted absolutely nothing to do with in my game, and books like Sandstorm and Frostburn, which are ones that, admittedly, I kind of wish I had now, because I did pick up some of the other books, the later books in that series. So one of these days I'm hoping to get those to fill in that void. But to that point, that was pretty much the only things that I had actually passed on. And I was collecting virtually everything else. I was collecting the accessories that were coming out. I was collecting all the books that came out. Actually, I did pass on the player's kit and the second iteration of the basic game for 3.5, but those were really the only exceptions. But with the announcement of 4th, it came out at a point where it was a year away that it was going to be released. So 4th edition released in 2008, so they announced it in 2007. And the issue is that 3.5 D&D was only 4 years old at that point. And 3rd edition with 3.0 that came out before it was only 3 years old when 3.5 came out. So you're looking at a version of the game that, the shortest lived edition to this point of D&D was 3rd edition. And you could really even make the argument that 3 and 3.5 were separate enough that you could almost consider them to be their own separate editions as well. So it was really just kind of frustrating and irritating, and it genuinely just felt like the reason that Wizards of the Coast made the announcement was because they were running, the well was running dry, and they needed to generate more revenue, which, they're a business, and I get that. But it still just really was really frustrating, because not only were they announcing a 4th edition, but the rumors were that it was going to be quite a bit different. So over the next year or so, I actually found that my desire to pick up the latest books had really dropped off. And there's very few books from the time 4th edition was announced to the discontinuation of 3.5 that I even bothered to pick up. And the ones that I got were the Drow monster-based book, Drow of the Underdark, I think it was called. So I picked that up. I picked up the Forge of War and the City of Stormreach for Eberron, and that was it. I passed on all the last 3 Forgotten Realms books because they were more adventures than the regional source books that I was hoping for, and I just wasn't really interested in more adventures at that point. So 4th edition, when it finally came out, there were a lot of things that just weren't going in its favor. And I remember, having sort of almost weekly discussions about, how it just wasn't the right time. And that was really what it came down to, is it just really wasn't the right time to announce a whole new edition. They were better off just putting out adventures for the next couple of years and letting 3.5 kind of breathe a bit. But it was just, releasing 2 or 3 books a month, every month for like 4 years, and then all of a sudden, yeah, we're going to bring out a whole new version of the game. They weren't helped by the fact that the Wizards of the Coast marketing at the time was really awful. And not that their marketing is super great now, but it has come a long way compared to what it used to be. So so they emphasized really all of the major changes that were going to, I don't want to say necessarily upset people, but the things that just made it the most drastically different. And instead of just talking about the ways that the game was still, very much just a tabletop role-playing fantasy experience, and things along those lines, they really focused on the drastic changes, and it turned a lot of people off, and myself included in that. So I remember just saying I wanted nothing to do with it, and I was at a point where I was fine if I never bought another D&D book, or so I thought. So, Christmas of 2008 comes, and I know I told the story before, but I opened up a present from my mother, and there was a copy of the 4th edition D&D Player's Handbook. And, she had gone to the bookstore, and I said that, mentioned that, I was into Dungeons and Dragons, and the person at the store said, well, this is the latest version that's pretty recent. So odds are he probably doesn't have it. Which he was right. I didn't have it, but I got the book, and I just remember I was touched by the thought behind the gift, but I wasn't interested in the actual gift itself. So it pretty much just sat on my shelf for quite a while, and I just left it there. And it's like, well, you know what? At least I've got the Player's Handbook from each of the editions, because I had the first edition Player's Handbook and stuff like that by now. So I continued to run my 3.5 games, and I'm gonna be honest, I was starting to get burnt out on 3.5. I remember I finished up the Shackled City Adventure Path, which was the first one put out by Paizo in Dungeon Magazine. And just a second here. And when I finished it, there were just certain things about the system that just didn't really sit well with me, or the way that the high-level adventures kind of went. And some of the biggest issues were adventures where, well, my biggest issues with 3rd edition were starting to become damage reduction, like weapon property-based damage reduction, and spell resistance, which was just huge in 3.5, especially at high levels. Very few encounters, unless you were going up against humans at that level, at higher levels, had you facing things that had either damage reduction that required specific weapon type, or spell resistance, or even both. And I just remember it was starting to get a little bit tedious. And I moved on to the next adventure path almost immediately after that, and I started running the Age of Worms. And the Age of Worms had the player characters fighting like a Grick in the first chapter, the first installment, and the bloody thing had damage reduction. And it was at this point, we were getting into 2010 at this point, and I was starting to, miss adding things to my D&D collection. I really enjoyed, the going out and buying books and bringing something home and have something to read was something that I kind of genuinely missed. So I remember I actually had printed off a 4th edition D&D character sheet. And one night when I was working back shift, I took the book in with me, and I made a character. I made a first level character, and it took a while, but you had a lot of time on back shift once you did everything, which I usually try to get out of the way, as quickly as possible. So I made a character, and it's like, this is kind of interesting. I like the idea of proficiency bonuses for the weapons, instead of a base attack bonus. So if you're proficient in a weapon, it adds a bonus to your attack rolls. I actually thought that was kind of a neat concept. And at its core, I liked the idea behind the at-will encounter and daily powers. Even though, the naming convention was probably not the best, and I freely admit that, but I like the idea of them. And it's translated into 5th edition now, so there's a lot of things that, like cantrips for wizards and clerics, for example. They give you, useful abilities that you can do an unlimited number of times per day, and those are at-will abilities. So the concept was sound, and it just wasn't presented well at the time. But I liked some of those things about it. And I decided that it was time to start thinking about it, about picking up the 4th edition stuff. I went to Toronto, Ontario, for a concert and visiting some of the game shops there, and they had some of the 4th edition D&D books. And I remember being very, very tempted to pick them up, but I held off. And I got back, and I just reached the point where it's like, it's time. One of the things that kind of pushed me over the edge for that was the announcement and the release of the D&D Essentials line, starting with the red box over there, which had the Menser D&D artwork on it, and had like the old school logo, and it was all around a very interesting starter set. It contained a choose your own path kind of adventure that you used to create your characters. So you had like blank character sheets, and you built your own first level characters from scratch using this adventure to kind of make the choices as to which class and race and which abilities you were going to have. And it was cool. It was actually an interesting idea, and I liked the idea of making your own characters for a starter set instead of just having like these pre-made ones that you just choose and go with. There's a little bit of customization to it. You kind of put a little bit of yourself into the adventure, and the adventure itself was actually pretty decent. You're going through these caverns, which had like goblins and kobolds and stuff like that were in separate sections. You could fight this young like wormling white dragon. Excuse me, which was a pretty cool fight. Overall, it was a very, very, very cool fight to actually do that, and I just liked the overall adventure. You had like the necromancer kind of experimenting on this item that he stole from a merchant that the player characters were protecting in his caravan. So it gets ambushed by goblins. The goblins steal something, and the caravan master wants it back, and it turns out to be this like skull that radiates necromantic energy. And there's a lot of stuff that could sort of open up doors for. So it actually, was, in my opinion, it was one of the better starter set adventures. But I looked at in particular, I looked at the monster stats, and there was something that I felt that was kind of missing from other D&D games, and that was the idea behind minions, elite monsters, and solo monsters. And I like those concepts so much that I actually introduced them into my Age of Worms campaign as I was going through it. So I was on the 3rd chapter, I think. No, I think no, must have been this. I think it was the 2nd chapter actually. So I had just recently started it when I finally picked up some 4th edition like monster books, the monster manuals, and the starter set for D&D Essentials, and I loved the idea, especially like minions and solo monsters were my 2 favorite takeaways. So minions are basically these little grunt creatures that have a single hit point, so any damage that you deal to them is sufficient to kill them, but they pad out an encounter, so they make like this wave of enemies that the players can kind of cut their way through, which is something that you see in a lot of movies. If you watch like the Lord of the Rings movies, for example, you see like, this, wave of attacking orcs that the heroes just cut down left, right, and center. And, the idea of minions is that it allows you to sort of recreate that. So I started incorporating those to make the encounters more interesting, and to make things like, cleave and abilities like that, more, I guess, useful, I guess you could say, so that a fighter with cleave could just just cut down scores of these things. But the idea is also that minions are dangerous enough that you can't completely ignore them, because their damage adds up. They're very simple to run. They always have a They always have a set value of damage that they deal. Their saving throws or defenses are, they are what they are. But for like third edition, for example, I would basically have like a set value for their saving throws. And anyway, they were just really cool creatures to have. And the solo monsters were also great because one of the big failings of 3.5, in my opinion, was the idea of having an enemy that the player characters fight by themselves, especially humanoid enemies. Like, there's some monsters that are fine, like dragons, for example, are always going to be sort of a tense fight. But even then, the amount of damage that high-level characters can do is enough to cut down some of these things pretty quickly. So, like, solo monsters had their hit points multiplied by like 4 or 5 over a basic version of it. And I remember liking this because there was one of the mid chapters in the Shackled City Adventure Path has this wizard, this like half-fiend wizard who's accompanying the party suddenly betray them. And I remember running that encounter, and his initiative sucked, so he ended up going last, and he got absolutely just cut down. And he was the final encounter of that adventure too. Like, he was supposed to be the big definitive like boss fight kind of idea. And because with third edition adventures, the idea started that you would end an adventure with sort of a big climactic encounter. So it just got absolutely just cut down. And so it's like, but if he were a solo monster, then he could have actually put up a fight. And so I kind of started to incorporate that stuff. And as time went on, I just really started liking more and more about 4th edition. And what came down for me was looking at the monster stats, and it's like, well, they don't have damage reduction the way that they did in 3rd edition, and they don't have spell resistance the way that they did in 3rd edition. So if you were resistant to magic spells, you took half damage. Or if you were, instead of being resistant to damage and requiring a certain weapon to overcome it, if you had if they were vulnerable to something and you had that kind of weapon, you would deal more damage. And I like that concept better because it worked the same way that resist did. So there were like the ability to resist non-magical weapon attacks or resist fire, cold, electricity, whatever, and it gave you a value. So if you're resistant 10, you would reduce the amount of damage you took from that source by 10. But if you were vulnerable 10, you would add that much to the damage that you took. So they were just concepts that I liked, and there was no spell resistance, which was a huge pain. So it eventually just reached the point where I said, you know what, I want to run 4th edition. So I wrapped up my Age of Worms campaign, and I think we took a week or two break. And I said, I really want to run a 4th edition game. I used the D&D Essentials stuff because it was easier to create beginning characters with Essentials because everything was much more well laid out, I guess you could say. Like in the player's handbook, you just had a whole slew of options to choose from. Whereas in the Essentials, everything was built around a theme. So you had like your theme of abilities, and you can choose one of the from the following list, or choose 2 from the following 3 options. So there was always choice, but everything was still built around a solid concept. And I ran through the starter set adventure, and I just remember everyone seemed to enjoy themselves, and while most of the players were hesitant, especially the people who were, from the old school of D&D, so to speak, were hesitant to say that they liked the system, they still enjoyed playing the game, and they were willing to admit that there were certain aspects of it that they enjoyed. And once you got past some of the things that were the common complaints kind of idea, I remember I was just talking to one of my players, and I was just like, I want to run 4th edition. He's like, oh yeah. It's like, why would you want to do that? And I just said to him, it's like, no damage reduction or spell resistance is like, sign me up. And he went out and bought a bunch of the books. So, and just running the adventures themselves, I ran the pre-made ones from the starter set, and I think I also ran the one from the monster vault, um, which was like the Cairn of the Winter King, I think it was called, which was a really, really interesting adventure in of itself. And so you had like the players kind of going through, like the Winter King had released all these undead creatures that was starting to attack the countryside, and the player characters had to go sort of deal with that situation. But one of the things that they found inside the dungeon area was there was a white dragon that was actually frozen, like frozen over in the ceiling, and the characters ended up accidentally waking up this dragon. So they fight the dragon, and they defeat it, and they find its hoard, and they deal with like the Winter King as well, and they take care of all that. But they find this ivory card, like almost like a tarot card kind of thing, inside of this, like lacquered wooden case. And what it was, the card had the image of like a broken sword on it. And they weren't sure exactly what it was that they had found. But what they had found was a card from the Deck of Many Things. Because I wanted to start running the Madness at Gardmore Abbey adventure. So I had the characters kind of do a couple of like side quests kind of idea before they started going towards the Abbey itself. And when they started making their trip to the Abbey, they encountered there was this encounter that I made, or this adventure that I made as a side trek along the way, and I wanted to capitalize on the ruin card that they found. So they end up going to this village, and the villagers are concerned because this mage tower, or this tower, obsidian tower, basically appeared overnight, not too far from the village itself, and some hunters went to go investigate. And what they found was a large group of skeletons outside of this tower. And they didn't actually stay to observe, they just saw these skeletons and they ran. They didn't get a good look at them, which the players would kind of find out later on. But they saw skeletons that they thought were children, and then they saw skeletons that they thought were just like human adults. So they run back to the village, and this is, while the characters are there. And the villagers, basically, they know that there's some sort of evil mage, in the area, and they hire the characters to go and clear to basically drive the evil wizard out. To kill him, actually, was what they had sent the players to do, because the townsfolk were really, really superstitious about magic. And so the players get there, and they actually took the time to observe what was going on. So the characters are observing, and they're seeing these skeletons, but instead of being armed for like battle or conquest or whatever the terrified hunters and woodsmen thought, they're wielding like farm implements, like sickles and like scythes, and they're cutting down, they're harvesting wheat and tending to fields and stuff like that. Just things that don't seem very evil of the skeletons. And as it turns out, so the players, they still, instinctively, like, they're skeletons, there's something nefarious going on. So they start attacking, and they destroy a few of these skeletons. But interestingly enough, like, none of the skeletons are fighting back. They just kind of stand there, and the player characters, like, they take a handful of them out. When all of a sudden, the wizard from the tower comes out, demanding, to know what the characters are up to. And they kind of talk to this necromancer, and they kind of learn a bit of his backstory. And basically, he was, at one point corrupted by the power of magic, and he admitted to doing terrible things. And but this was his home, and he's come home to sort of make amends, and he's taking up almost the mantle of protector for the village itself. So the goblins and hobgoblins that were serving as his skeleton minions were actually ones that were planning on raiding the village, and he ends up like taking them out, sort of thing, and then changes them or brings them back as skeletons to help with the fields, to help the villagers get through the winter kind of idea that was coming up. So, the characters realize that he's actually not, a villain, but the villagers are absolutely terrified of him. So they want, him to come back and speak with the duke of the town or the village. So they bring him back, and the villagers are super suspicious and very paranoid, and everything sort of breaks down into a shouting match between the villagers who were wanting to hear the necromancer out, the villagers who just said he can't be trusted and wanted him dead, the town council sort of thing, the duke as well as his advisors were all arguing with one another. And, the necromancer was trying to argue his case as well, and all the while, as this escalates, and the characters are sort of witnessing this, and they're lending their voices to it as well. As this escalates, all of a sudden, the symbol from the card that they had picked up, the broken sword, starts to kind of like appear as a sigil on the ground in the middle of everything. And it was a very subtle effect that happened slowly as these tensions sort of built up. And it basically starts to break down to a fight. So you have like some of the villagers jump the necromancer with, like pitchforks or, daggers or something like that and try to kill him. And this big fight breaks out. And as it happens, you see this like rune on the ground that's the symbol of the card of ruin from the deck of many things start to glow brighter and brighter and brighter. Eventually the player characters do manage to settle everybody down. And they arrive at a peaceful solution, and the room sort of disappears, and then at that point they actually realize what it is that they have was a card from the deck of many things, and they study a little bit closer, and they learn its true identity. But the idea behind the adventure was that the card of ruin was going to potentially ruin something. It was either going to ruin the village by having, because the necromancer was going to defend himself. And it was all too easy for him to slip into, his destructive form of magic, and he could have easily taken out the village by himself, sort of thing. So it either would have led to the ruin of the village, or it would have led to the personal ruin of the necromancer. Because even if he destroys the village, he gives in to, again, his darker side, and his chance at redemption is basically gone. Or it just leads to his ruin by the player characters like slaughtering him or killing him, even though he was trying to protect the town. And the thing is, if the player character simply killed the necromancer, came back to town, collected a reward, and left, on their way back, they would have found the town completely destroyed, as it was overrun by like goblins and hobgoblins and other creatures. So it was just one of those things that the card draw was completely random. And I remember it's like the ruin card, which seemed like such a source of inspiration, that I built this whole scenario sort of around it, and just wanted to show like how the influence of this item was starting to spread, and basically returning it to going to the Abbey. They were going to find answers to what it was initially. That was the whole reason that they wanted to go there, because they had heard that it was a repository for unique and potentially dangerous items. And when you get this like magical card that radiates a very strong magic, and it's got the symbol of a broken sword on it, they just kind of naturally wanted to do something with it. Unfortunately, I never really got all the way through Madness at Gardmore Abbey. It just was at a point where I was going through quite a bit of burnout at this point, because I had been running regularly for like 2.5 years, like every single week. And it was just starting to sort of wear on me with other stuff that was kind of going on in my life at the time. Like I was starting to see my fiance today. Like we were starting to get to know each other. And anyway, I was just getting a little burnt out. So I never got to finish the adventure, unfortunately, which really kind of sucked. But I just remember having a lot of, really enjoying running that adventure that I created around the theme of the Card of Ruin, and how its influence could potentially, like I said, just take down, ruin an entire village, like destroy an entire village just by its subtle influence. So it was a while before I got to run fourth edition again, and I remember so shortly after I kind of wrapped that up. We played like a first edition AD&D game for a bit. A friend of mine ran, which friend of mine ran? Another friend ran Pathfinder for a little bit, and then ran Traveler for a little bit. And I was getting ready to run a second edition AD&D game when things started to get really serious between myself and my fiance. So I ended up moving. Moving from the Annapolis Valley to the South Shore, which was, an hour and a half drive away. So for a while, I just wasn't running anything, and I had nobody to really, talk D&D with. I just had nobody to sort of talk about the things that I was used to discussing, the things that I've enjoyed and loved talking about for years. And suddenly I just didn't have that option. So my fiance, and God love her, she said, well, why don't you try running a game for me? And I remember we started with 3rd edition, 3.5, and made a character with that. And she wasn't all that keen on it. It's like, well, you know what? Why don't I actually run this version of the game? And I picked up my 4th edition Player's Handbook. And it's like, why don't we make a character using this? And she liked that system a lot better. She liked the way that the powers worked. The concept of spell level being different than character level was something that just seems needlessly confusing, when in 4th edition your power level was the level that your character was when you got it. So instead of Fireball being a 3rd level spell that a 5th level character gets, or a 5th level wizard gets, Fireball was now a 5th level power that a 5th level wizard got. So it just made a lot more sense to her. She liked the idea behind the at-will encounter and daily abilities, just like the way that those kind of worked a lot better. And I ran her through the starter set adventure again for the red box. And after that, I designed another little scenario that she went through. And it was just a lot of fun. Now, she kind of realized that it wasn't really her thing, and she told me, and I didn't take it well at first. I'm not going to lie. I definitely didn't react the way that I should have, but it was just a huge blow to me because I was enjoying it so much that when she said, it's really not something that I'm interested in, it just took the wind right out of my sails. But eventually I did find some friends at the call center that I worked at that were interested in getting into tabletop role-playing, and we started with D&D 4th edition. Because it was an easier version to teach overall. The basic concepts behind it were, again, with the power structures, were just something that beginners were able to it just felt more natural in terms of how it was explained and how the wording kind of lined up with the abilities, and you didn't have like contradictory terms or like things that didn't line up properly, like spell level and character level, which was again sort of a big hurdle for a lot of beginners. So I ended up running that again, and for the 3rd time I ran the starter set adventure. So that red box for D&D Essentials I got a lot of use out of. And just so the basic thing is that at the end of the day, when I finally gave 4th edition a chance, there was a lot about it that I really enjoyed. And some of the arguments that, and I've defended it a lot, and I know it's kind of given me a reputation as being like the 4th edition guy sort of thing, or someone who will just blindly defend 4th edition, and it's definitely not blind. But there were a lot of things that I enjoy about it. And I remember recently someone was asking if it was possible to play 4th edition without a grid, and everyone was saying, no, you have to have a grid to play it. But you really don't. And I just remember looking at it, and it's like, well, no, all you have to do is replace squares with 5-foot increments. And that's it. That's all you'd have to do to play it as sort of like a not using a grid or not relying on miniatures in a grid. So, for example, if your speed was 6 squares, you multiply 6 by 5 and you move 30 feet. That's simple. For your burst, blasts, and close blasts, all you need to know is that like a burst is sort of like a cone shaped, essentially. It's like a cone-shaped attack that its point of origin has to start radiate from you. So things like Burning Hands, for example, would be a burst ability, or Close Burst, I guess, would be... Close Burst would be the one for that. So it was... you would have it, sort of do that, and... oh, no, sorry. Burst was the origin started where you were, and it moved out. So, like Burning Hands, yeah, you'd have to be. It has to come from your caster, but it spreads out. A Close Burst is basically something that radiates out from you. So, if you had something that was like a Close Burst 1, for example, it basically would just, a spell that would attack everybody within a 5-foot space of you, and that's how you would just translate it. Is if it's like Close Burst 1. Then, everything within 5 feet gets hit with this ability. If it's Close Burst 2, everything within 10 feet gets hit with this ability. And then with Blast, they target a point, and they, it's a certain number of squares from that to a side. So, but that's the same as just having a radius. So, you'd have, like Burst Fireball, which was a Blast, Blast 4. You pick a spot, and the blast went out 4 squares on all sides, sort of thing. And it's the same thing as just having a 20-foot radius. So you really can, with just a little bit of just changing terminology and redefining values that really aren't that complicated to do, you could totally run 4th edition without using miniatures on a map. It's and if they say, well, no, you have to use this. Like, well, no, just look at 5th edition. 5th edition has things that radiate out 5 feet from you, or everything within 10 feet. Thunder Wave, for example, is an ability that spreads out 15 feet from the caster in all directions. So, it goes out, it'd be the same as a Close Burst 3. Burning Hands encompasses everything within, a cone. Same thing as just a burst. And then you've got, Fireball, which would be the same thing as, it works pretty much the same way mechanically. Covers pretty much the same area mechanically as it did between 5th and 4th edition. But a lot of people play 5th edition without a grid. So it's something that could definitely be done. And after I just left the comics there, everyone was saying, no, you have to. It's like, well, no, this is how you can play it without a grid. You just change squares to feet, and these are how these things work. It's the same way that they work in previous editions. So ultimately, even though the total amount of time that I spent running 4th edition was relatively minor, if I added up all the weeks that I ran 4th edition together, it was probably about 4 months, maybe, total that I ran the version of the game. Maybe 5. I had a lot of fun doing it. And it's one of those things that, for anyone who's curious about it, I recommend trying it out. As it stands right now, the 4th edition core books are still relatively easy to come by and relatively cheap. The price creep hasn't totally affected it yet, but it's something that has started to change. But it's just something that, again, I had a lot of fun running it, and my players had fun playing it. And for all the arguments that it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons, at the end of the day, it still felt like a Dungeons and Dragons, game to me. Because to me, Dungeons and Dragons was always more than just the rules and the magic system. It was the experience of just getting friends together and playing through this fantasy role-playing world. Fighting things like beholders and drow and mind flayers, and those things are still a really prevalent part of 4th edition D&D. And they changed some things, and again, the wording probably wasn't the best, and the timing was absolutely atrocious. But I really enjoyed it, and my players enjoyed it. And I'm sure that if I called up those friends again and said, hey, I'm going to be in town for a night, and I wanted to run a 4th edition one-shot, are you guys interested? I'm sure the answer would be yes. So anyway, those are just sort of like my experiences with it. And again, I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed 4th edition, and I still consider it to be one of my favorite versions of the D&D game today. It's one that I would easily be willing to pull off the shelf and run or play, and not even think twice about it. Just, absolutely, someone's like, well, I like, 5th edition or stuff like that, but I want to try some of the older ones. Is there an older one that you can recommend? It's like, well, let's go back to 4th edition and try that out. So it's a system that, like I said, I grew to appreciate once I finally gave it the opportunity. And that's all that I really ask of people. It's like, if you're not interested in it, you're not interested in it. But don't make it so that anyone who is interested in it, needs to feel guilty for being interested in this version of the game. It's a totally valid way to play, a fantasy role-playing game. And to me, it still felt like a Dungeons and Dragons game at the end of the day. So anyway, those are my experiences with 4th edition. But let me know in the comments below. Have any of you played 4th edition? And what were your thoughts and feelings on it? And again, try to keep things civil. If you didn't like 4th edition, and you don't like 4th edition, then just leave it be, because this video is definitely not for you, if that's the case. I don't want to see the comment section filled with, all this kind of negativity. It's like, if you played it and you enjoyed it, that's fine. If you played it and you didn't enjoy it, that's fine as well, because you actually tried it. But if you're one of those people who just says, well, 4th edition sucks, and anyone who likes it doesn't, appreciate real D&D, just, don't even bother leaving those kind of comments here, because it's just asinine and not worth the time to even do it. And I'm not going to respond to any of those types of comments. But anyway, yeah, so let me know, like I said, in the comments below what some of your 4th edition experiences were, and I look forward to reading them. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we will see you next time. Take care.